The blood-curdling scream echoed through the quiet Sunday morning in Cody, Wyoming, 1878, silencing the hymns that had been rising from the whitewashed church. Sarah Harlow clutched at the wooden pew, her knuckles turning white as her uncle's fingers twisted deeper into her chestnut hair, yanking her backward toward the door. The congregation sat frozen, their shocked expressions flickering in the light streaming through the stained glass windows. "You ain't welcome here, girl," Edgar Harlow's voice boomed through the sanctuary, his whiskey-soured breath hot against Sarah's neck. "Not after what you done." Sarah's shoes scraped against the floorboards as she struggled against his iron grip. 22 years of living under her uncle's roof had taught her that resistance only fueled his rage, but today in God's house she found herself fighting back. "I've done nothing wrong," she cried out, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks. Her gaze darted desperately around the church, searching for a single soul brave enough to intervene. Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit, his Bible clutched against his chest, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Please," she begged, reaching toward the congregation people she'd known her entire life. But their eyes fell to their hymnals, their silence a crushing weight. Her uncle dragged her down the center aisle, her white Sunday dress tearing at the shoulder. The pain at her scalp was excruciating, but it was the public humiliation that cut deepest. Since her parents' death from typhoid when she was just 7, Sarah had endured her uncle's cruelty behind closed doors. Now everyone could see the truth she'd hidden for so long. The church doors burst open, flooding the dim interior with harsh sunlight. Sarah squinted against the brightness, tears blurring her vision as her uncle dragged her down the steps. "Enough," the commanding voice cut through the morning air like a bullwhip. A tall figure stepped forward, silhouetted against the bright sky. Sarah could make out the broad shoulders, the stance of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Let her go." The stranger's voice was quiet now, but there was steel beneath the softness. Edgar Harlow sneered, his grip tightening. "Mind your own business, cowboy. This here's family business." "Not anymore." The man stepped closer, and Sarah could finally see his face weathered and tanned from years under the western sun, with eyes as blue and fierce as a mountain lake in winter. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, though he hadn't drawn it. "I said let her go." Her uncle hesitated, sizing up the stranger. The cowboy was younger, perhaps 30 to Edgar's 55, and his body was hardened by years of physical labor. Sarah felt her uncle's fingers loosen slightly. "This ungrateful wretch is my responsibility," Edgar spat. "She's been caught stealing from my store. She'll answer to me." The cowboy's eyes narrowed as he took in Sarah's tear-streaked face, the red marks where her uncle's fingers had dug into her skin, the torn dress. "She'll answer to me before God," he said, his voice carrying to the churchgoers who had begun to filter out of the building, drawn by the commotion. "And then, if need be, to the law, but you won't lay another hand on her." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs, the tension between the two men crackling like lightning before a storm. Edgar finally released her with a rough shove that sent her stumbling forward. The cowboy caught her elbow, steadying her without taking his eyes off her uncle. "This ain't over," Edgar growled, jabbing a finger in their direction. "Sheriff Tate's a friend of mine. We'll see how quick he believes a drifter over a respected businessman." The cowboy didn't respond, simply maintaining his stance between Sarah and her uncle until Edgar turned and stalked away, shoving through the gathered crowd. Only when Edgar had disappeared around the corner did Sarah feel the stranger's grip on her arm relax. She looked up into his face, trying to place him among the town's familiar faces. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, "but I don't know you." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Name's Jacob Vance, just rode into town yesterday." He released her arm and took a step back, giving her space. "You got someplace safe to go, miss?" Sarah Harlow." She brushed her hair back from her face, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "And no, I don't. That was my uncle. I live with him." Jacob frowned, glancing in the direction Edgar had gone. "Not anymore, you don't." Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. "But I have nowhere else. Mrs. Abernathy runs a boarding house on Pine Street," came a voice from behind them. Sarah turned to see Mrs. Miller, the seamstress, stepping forward from the crowd. "I'm sure she'd take you in, dear." For the first time in her life, Sarah saw compassion in the older woman's eyes rather than the usual judgment. Other townspeople began to murmur in agreement. "I've got some money saved," Sarah said, squaring her shoulders despite her trembling hands. Years of secretly setting aside pennies from her work at her uncle's general store had given her a small nest egg hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. Jacob nodded. "First things first. Let's get your belongings from your uncle's place while he's still cooling his heels somewhere else." Sarah hesitated, looking around at the dispersing churchgoers. No one had ever stood up for her before, and now a stranger and the very people who had watched in silence for years were offering help. "Why now?" she asked quietly, her eyes moving from face to face. "You've all seen how he treats me for years." The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken by Pastor Williams, who had finally found his courage now that the immediate danger had passed. "We've failed you, Miss Harlow," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "But perhaps the Lord sent Mr. Vance here today to show us our own shortcomings." Jacob shifted uncomfortably at being cast as a divine messenger. "I'm just a man who can't abide seeing a woman mistreated," he said gruffly. "Now we should move quickly before your uncle returns." Sarah nodded, gathering her resolve. This moment, this stranger's unexpected intervention felt like the first page of a new chapter in her life. A chapter where she might finally be free from the shadow of fear that had hung over her since childhood. As she walked beside Jacob toward her uncle's house, the spring sunshine warming her shoulders, Sarah dared to feel something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The walk to her uncle's house was silent, with Sarah leading the way and Jacob following a respectful distance behind. The modest two-story home sat at the edge of town, its white paint peeling and the front porch sagging slightly, a stark contrast to the prosperous general store her uncle ran on Main Street. "He'll be at the saloon," Sarah said as they approached the house. "That's where he always goes after church, but we should hurry." Jacob nodded, his eyes scanning the property with the wariness of a man accustomed to anticipating trouble. "I'll wait out here while you gather your things. Shout if you need me." Sarah slipped inside, her footsteps light on the familiar floorboards. She moved quickly through the house, gathering the few precious possessions that truly belonged to her. Her mother's silver hairbrush, a small Bible, 2 dresses and a nightgown, and the tin box containing her savings $27.42, accumulated over years of careful hoarding. She was folding her shawl when she heard the front door slam open. "You ungrateful little whore," Sarah's heart seized in her chest. Edgar's heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs and she backed against the wall, clutching her bundle. Where was Jacob? Her uncle appeared in the doorway, his face mottled red with rage and drink. "Think you can embarrass me in front of the whole town and then steal from me?" "I'm only taking what's mine," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Edgar lunged forward, but before he could reach her, another figure appeared behind him. Jacob grabbed Edgar by the collar and yanked him backward. "I thought I made myself clear earlier," Jacob said, his voice dangerously quiet. Edgar whirled around, his fist flying toward Jacob's face. The cowboy sidestepped easily, allowing Edgar's momentum to carry him into the wall. Before her uncle could recover, Jacob had him pinned, one arm twisted behind his back. "Sarah, get your things and go," Jacob instructed, his eyes never leaving Edgar. "Head to that boarding house." "I'll be along shortly." Sarah hesitated only a moment before gathering her bundle and moving toward the door. "You can't leave," Edgar shouted. "Everything you have is because of my charity. Your parents left you with nothing." Sarah paused at the door, turning back to face the man who had made her life a misery for 15 years. "They left me with their love and their good name. You've tried to take both, but you failed." With those words, she descended the stairs and walked out of the house, not looking back. The bright afternoon sunlight felt like a blessing on her skin as she made her way toward Pine Street. Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house was a tidy 3-story building with a wide porch wrapped around the front and white lace curtains in every window. Sarah had passed it countless times but never imagined she might one day be seeking shelter there. She hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps, suddenly conscious of her torn dress and disheveled hair. What if Mrs. Abernathy turned her away? Before she could lose her nerve, the front door opened and Mrs. Miller emerged. "There you are, child," the seamstress said, hurrying down to meet her. I came ahead to explain everything to Viola, Mrs. Abernathy. She's expecting you. Sarah blinked back tears. Thank you, she whispered, Mrs. Miller patted her arm. It's the least I could do. We've all failed you for too long. Inside, Mrs. Abernathy, a widow in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a severe bun, showed Sarah to a small but clean room on the second floor. $2 a week includes breakfast and supper, she explained, her voice brisk but not unkind. No gentlemen callers in the rooms, no liquor on the premises, and curfew is 9 o'clock. Yes, madam, Sarah said, placing her bundle on the narrow bed. I'll be no trouble, Mrs. Abernathy's stern expression softened slightly. I know you won't, dear. I've watched you grow up in this town, always proper despite your circumstances. She hesitated. If you're needing work, Mrs. Miller mentioned she could use help in her shop. Sarah's eyes widened. Really? I can sew quite well. My mother taught me before. Then it's settled, Mrs. Abernathy said with a decisive nod. Now get yourself settled. Supper's at 6 sharp. After the landlady left, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the clean quilt. For the first time in her memory, she was truly alone and free. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Jacob standing in the hallway, hat in hand. You're all right, he asked, his eyes searching her face. Sarah nodded. Thanks to you, what happened with my uncle? We came to an understanding, Jacob said, his expression revealing nothing. He won't be bothering you again. Sarah raised an eyebrow, just like that. You don't know Edgar Harlow. Maybe not, Jacob conceded. But I know men like him. They're only brave when they're facing someone weaker. He placed his hat back on his head. I'll be staying at the Silver Dollar Hotel for a few days. If he gives you any trouble, you come find me. Why are you helping me? Sarah asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since he'd intervened at the church. You don't know me. Jacob's eyes held hers for a long moment. My ma used to say that a person's character is revealed not by how they treat their equals, but by how they treat those who are vulnerable. He shrugged. Besides, no decent man stands by while a woman is being hurt. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the spring afternoon. Well, thank you, Mr. Vance. I'm in your debt. Jacob, he corrected her, and there's no debt between us. He tipped his hat and turned to leave. Jacob, she called after him, making him pause at the top of the stairs. Will I see you again? A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his serious expression. Count on it, Miss Harlow. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the quiet boarding house, Sarah listened to the unfamiliar sounds of other lodgers moving about and marveled at how completely her life had changed in a single day. For the first time since her parents' death, she fell asleep without fear knotting her stomach. The next morning, Sarah awoke to sunlight streaming through her window. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was, accustomed as she was to the small, dark room in her uncle's house. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up, a mixture of anxiety and excitement washing over her. After dressing in her one good dress that hadn't been torn, she made her way downstairs to find several other boarders already seated around the large dining table. Mrs. Abernathy was serving plates of eggs, biscuits, and bacon. There you are, Miss Harlow, the landlady said. Take a seat. You'll want a good breakfast before starting at Mrs. Miller's shop. Sarah nodded her thanks and slipped into an empty chair, acutely aware of the curious glances from the other boarders, 2 older women who were school teachers, a young man who worked at the bank, and a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as the telegraph operator. Is it true that Cowboy nearly shot your uncle right in front of the church? The telegraph operator asked eagerly, leaning forward. Miss Winters, Mrs. Abernathy admonished, let the poor girl eat her breakfast in peace. Sarah gave the landlady a grateful look and focused on her food, which was simple but more plentiful than the meager portions she'd been allowed at her uncle's table. By the time she'd finished eating, the other boarders had dispersed to their various jobs, and Mrs. Abernathy was clearing the dishes. Don't mind Esther, Mrs. Abernathy said, nodding toward the door through which Miss Winters had just departed. She's not unkind, just starved for excitement. It's not every day we have such drama in Cody. It's all right, Sarah replied, rising to help with the dishes. I suppose everyone will be talking about it. Mrs. Abernathy waved her away from the wash basin. "You'll be late for Mrs. Miller. Go on now and hold your head high. You've done nothing to be ashamed of." With those words bolstering her courage, Sarah stepped out into the morning sunshine and made her way to Main Street. She couldn't help but notice how people watched her pass, some nodding in greeting, others whispering behind their hands. She kept her gaze forward, Mrs. Abernathy's advice echoing in her mind. The seamstress shop was already open when she arrived, the bell above the door announcing her entrance. Mrs. Miller looked up from behind the counter where she was measuring fabric for a customer. "Sarah, good morning," she called. "I'll be with you in just a moment." Sarah waited patiently, taking in the neat shelves stocked with bolts of fabric in every color and pattern imaginable, the glass cases displaying buttons and ribbons, and the dress forms wearing half-completed garments. The shop smelled of new cloth, and the lavender sachets Mrs. Miller kept in the drawers. After the customer left, Mrs. Miller showed Sarah to a small workstation at the back of the shop where she would be responsible for simple alterations and finishing work. "Your mother was one of the finest seamstresses I ever knew," Mrs. Miller said as she demonstrated how she wanted the hems finished. "I see her skill in your needlework." Sarah blinked back sudden tears. "Thank you, I remember watching her so. She made it look like magic." Mrs. Miller patted her hand. "You'll do just fine here. Now I've got to attend to the front. Call if you need me." The morning passed quickly as Sarah fell into a rhythm with her needle. The work was soothing, allowing her mind to drift as her hands stayed busy. Just before noon, the bell above the shop door rang again and Sarah glanced up to see Jacob entering. He spotted her immediately, a smile warming his features as he removed his hat. "Miss Harlow, Mrs. Miller mentioned I might find you here." Sarah set aside her work and went to greet him. Today, in the clear light of the shop, she could better appreciate his appearance. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes worn but clean. He looked like a man who took pride in himself despite not having much. "Mr. Vance Jacob," she corrected herself. "What brings you by?" "I thought you might join me for dinner," he said. "If Mrs. Miller can spare you." From the front of the shop, Mrs. Miller called, "Of course she can. Take your time, Sarah." Sarah felt a blush creeping up her neck at the knowing look Mrs. Miller gave her. "Let me get my shawl," she murmured. Outside, the spring day had grown warm, the streets busy with the midday activities of the small town. Sarah was intensely aware of the stares they attracted as they walked side by side toward the hotel restaurant. "People are watching us," she said quietly. Jacob's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Let them, we're not doing anything wrong." "No, but," Sarah hesitated. "My reputation is intact," Jacob finished firmly. "You're a respectable woman having a meal with the man who helped you out of a bad situation, nothing improper about that." Sarah wasn't entirely convinced, but she appreciated his confidence. As they entered the hotel restaurant a step above the saloon dining room and one of the nicest establishments in town, she couldn't help but notice Sheriff Tate seated near the window. The lawman's eyes narrowed as he watched them take a table. "Your uncle's been to see him," Jacob said, following her gaze. "Came to my room at the crack of dawn, warning me that Edgar Harlow was making accusations." Sarah's stomach clenched. "What kind of accusations?" "The usual nonsense a man like that would say, that you stole from him, that I'm some kind of troublemaker passing through." Jacob shrugged. The sheriff seemed more interested in keeping the peace than taking sides. Said as long as there's no more public disturbances, he'll stay out of it. Sarah nodded, though worry still gnawed at her. She knew her uncle wouldn't give up so easily. "Now," Jacob said, clearly trying to change the subject, "tell me something about yourself that doesn't involve your uncle." The simple question caught her off guard. For so long, her identity had been defined by her relationship to Edgar Harlow, his orphaned niece, his burden, his servant in all but name. Who was she apart from that? "I love to read," she said finally. "Whenever I could sneak a book from the school or borrow one from the minister's wife. And I love thunderstorms, watching the lightning from the window and counting the seconds until the thunder comes." Jacob's smile deepened, creating creases at the corners of his eyes. "What kind of books?" "Any kind. Stories about far-off places, adventures, even those penny dreadfuls that everyone pretends are so scandalous." She found herself smiling back. "What about you? Tell me something about Jacob Vance that I wouldn't know from looking at you." He considered this as the waiter brought their meals: roast beef with potatoes for him, chicken and dumplings for her. "I can play the fiddle," he said finally. "Not well enough to make a living at it, but well enough to join in when folks are making music." "Really?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "I've always wanted to learn an instrument, but my uncle said it was a frivolous waste of time." "Nothing frivolous about music," Jacob said, his voice warm. "It feeds the soul." As they ate, Jacob told her about growing up on a small ranch in Colorado, learning to break horses from his father, and how he'd spent the last few years moving from job to job across the Western Territories: ranch hand, trail driver, occasional bounty hunter when times were lean. "What brought you to Cody?" Sarah asked, fascinated by his stories of places she'd only read about. Something flickered across Jacob's face, a hesitation, perhaps. "Heard there might be work at the Sullivan Ranch outside of town. They're looking for someone who knows horses, and that's something I do know. Mr. Sullivan has the finest horses in the county," Sarah confirmed. "He supplies the stage line and breeds racing stock too." "That's the plan anyway," Jacob said. "I'm meeting with him tomorrow." He paused. "Though I admit, after yesterday, I've found another reason to consider staying in Cody for a while." The way he looked at her as he said it sent a flutter through Sarah's chest. No man had ever looked at her that way before, like she was someone worth knowing, worth protecting. Their conversation continued easily through the meal, and Sarah was surprised to find herself laughing at Jacob's dry observations about life on the trail. It occurred to her that she couldn't remember the last time she had laughed genuinely. As they were finishing their coffee, the restaurant door opened and Edgar Harlow stepped inside. The conversation in the room dimmed as people noticed him, then his niece, then the obvious tension crackling in the air. Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Sarah reached across the table, placing her fingers lightly on his wrist. "Not here," she whispered. Edgar spotted them and stalked toward their table, his face flushed with anger or drink or both. He stopped a few feet away, glaring down at Sarah. "So this is where my money went," he sneered. "Fancy meals with a drifter while I'm left with no one to mind the store." Sarah lifted her chin. "I worked for you for 15 years without wages, Uncle. You're owed nothing from me." Edgar's face darkened further. "You ungrateful, that's far enough, Harlow," came Sheriff Tate's voice as he rose from his table and approached. "You're causing a disturbance in a public place." Edgar turned his glare on the lawman. "This doesn't concern you, Tate." "Actually, it does," the sheriff replied evenly. "My job is keeping the peace, and right now you're disturbing it. I suggest you go cool off somewhere else." For a moment, it seemed Edgar might argue, but a lifetime of maintaining respectability in the community ultimately won out over his desire for confrontation. With a final venomous look at Sarah and Jacob, he turned and stalked out of the restaurant. Sheriff Tate tipped his hat to Sarah. "Miss Harlow, Mr. Vance." Then he too departed, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. Jacob reached across the table and covered Sarah's hand with his own. "You all right?" Sarah nodded, though she felt shaken. "I've never stood up to him before yesterday. It feels strange, but good." "You're stronger than you know," Jacob said, his blue eyes serious. "Most folks in your situation would have broken long ago." As they left the restaurant, Jacob insisted on walking Sarah back to the seamstress shop, though it was only a short distance away. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked as they paused outside the shop door. "Count on it," he repeated his words from the previous day. "Maybe I could call on you properly tomorrow evening, if Mrs. Abernathy allows gentlemen callers on the porch, that is." Sarah's heart quickened. "She does until 8 o'clock. "Then I'll be there at 6, he promised, tipping his hat before turning to leave. Sarah watched him go, a warm feeling spreading through her chest despite the lingering anxiety from her uncle's confrontation. For the first time in her memory, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The next day passed in a blur of anticipation for Sarah. Mrs. Miller kept her busy with alterations and gave her a length of blue calico to make herself a new dress to replace the one that was torn, she explained with a kind smile. When Sarah protested that she couldn't accept such generosity, Mrs. Miller shook her head firmly. "Consider it an advance on your wages. Besides, every young woman deserves a pretty new dress when a handsome man comes calling." By the time Sarah returned to the boarding house that evening, she barely had time to wash up and change into her one good dress before Jacob arrived. Mrs. Abernathy showed him to the front porch, where a swing and several rocking chairs provided a comfortable spot for boarders to entertain visitors. "Miss Harlow will be down directly," the landlady informed him, her tone making it clear that she would be keeping a watchful eye on the proceedings. When Sarah appeared on the porch a few minutes later, Jacob rose from the swing, a smile spreading across his face. He looked different today, his usual trail clothes replaced by a clean white shirt, dark vest, and polished boots. His dark hair was slicked back, and he'd clearly just shaved. "You look lovely," he said, his voice sincere. Sarah smoothed her hands over her skirt, suddenly self-conscious. "Thank you, so do you, handsome, I mean." They sat side by side on the porch swing, maintaining a proper distance as Mrs. Abernathy busied herself watering the potted geraniums within earshot. "How was your day?" Jacob asked, setting the swing in gentle motion with one foot. "Good," Sarah replied. "Mrs. Miller is teaching me to cut patterns. And yours, did you meet with Mr. Sullivan?" Jacob nodded, his expression pleased. "I did. He's hired me on as his head horseman. Seems the last fellow took off for California after hearing about the silver strikes there." "That's wonderful." Sarah exclaimed, "Mr. Sullivan's ranch is only 3 miles from town." "Means I'll be staying in Cody for a while," Jacob said, his eyes holding hers. "If that's all right with you." Sarah felt a blush creeping up her neck. "I think I'd like that very much." They talked as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the porch. Jacob told her more about his travels, and Sarah shared stories of her childhood before her parents died, memories she'd kept locked away for years. "My father used to take me fishing in the creek outside town," she reminisced. "Mother would scold him for letting me come home with my dress muddy, but she always smiled when she did it." "They sound like good people," Jacob said softly. Sarah nodded, surprised to find she could speak of her parents now with more joy than pain. "They were. I wish you could have known them." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Mrs. Abernathy cleared her throat meaningfully. "It's nearly 8, Miss Harlow," she announced. Jacob rose, offering Sarah his hand to help her up from the swing. "May I call on you again tomorrow?" "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," Sarah replied with newfound boldness. Under Mrs. Abernathy's watchful eye, Jacob lifted Sarah's hand to his lips, pressing a chaste kiss to her knuckles. "Until tomorrow, then." Sarah watched him walk down the street toward the hotel, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it. She turned to find Mrs. Abernathy regarding her with a mixture of approval and caution. "He seems a decent sort," the landlady admitted. "But mind you remember your reputation, young lady. This town has a long memory for scandal." "Yes, madam," Sarah promised, though she couldn't quite suppress her smile as she climbed the stairs to her room. The next few weeks fell into a pleasant pattern. Sarah worked at the seamstress shop during the day, developing her skills and earning her first real wages. Jacob divided his time between the Sullivan Ranch and town, often meeting Sarah for lunch or calling on her in the evenings. The townspeople gradually became accustomed to seeing them together. Some, like Mrs. Miller, openly approved of the match. Others, particularly those who had been closest to Edgar Harlow, regarded them with suspicion. Edgar himself made a point of crossing the street whenever he saw Sarah coming, his face set in a permanent scowl. On a warm Saturday in early June, Jacob arrived at the boarding house with a picnic basket and a borrowed buggy. "I thought we might go out to the creek," he suggested. "If Mrs. Abernathy approves of a proper outing in daylight, that is." The landlady, who had grown increasingly fond of Jacob over the past weeks, nodded her permission. "Be back before dark, and mind you behave yourselves." They drove out of town, following the winding road that paralleled the creek. Sarah had completed her new blue calico dress, and she wore it today with a matching ribbon in her hair. Beside her, Jacob handled the horse with easy confidence, occasionally stealing glances at her that made her heart flutter. "You know," he said as they neared the creek, "first time I saw you, I thought you were the bravest woman I'd ever met." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Brave? I was terrified." "That's what makes it brave," Jacob replied, "being scared but standing your ground anyway." He pulled the buggy to a stop in a grassy clearing beside the creek, the very spot where Sarah's father had taught her to fish all those years ago. A large cottonwood tree provided shade, and wildflowers dotted the grass like colorful stars. Jacob helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. They spread a blanket beneath the tree and unpacked the picnic cold fried chicken, biscuits, apple pie, and a jar of lemonade that Mrs. Abernathy had contributed to their outing. As they ate, Sarah found herself studying Jacob's profile, the strong line of his jaw, now clean-shaven for their outing, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. In just a few short weeks, he had become more important to her than she could have imagined possible. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, catching her gaze. "How different my life is now," she admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming and I'll wake up back in my uncle's house." Jacob reached across the blanket, taking her hand in his. "This is real, Sarah. You made it real by having the courage to leave." "With your help," she reminded him. "I just gave you a push at the right moment," he said with a modest shrug. "You were ready to fly." After they finished eating, they walked along the creek bank, Sarah showing Jacob the best spots for fishing and the shallow pool where she'd learned to swim. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground with patterns of light and shadow. "Sarah," Jacob said as they paused beside the water, "there's something I need to tell you." Something in his tone made Sarah's heart constrict. "What is it?" He led her back to their blanket under the tree, sitting down and gently pulling her down beside him. "When I came to Cody," he began, his eyes serious, "I wasn't just looking for work. I was looking for someone." Sarah frowned, confused by this revelation. "Who?" Jacob took a deep breath. 15 years ago, my father's ranch in Colorado was raided by men who claimed to be collecting a debt. My father insisted there was no debt, but they shot him anyway, took everything we had. My mother and I barely escaped with our lives." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Jacob, that's terrible," he nodded grimly. "For years we scraped by. My mother never recovered from losing my father that way. She died 3 winters ago. Before she passed, she made me promise I wouldn't spend my life seeking revenge, said it would poison my soul." "A wise woman," Sarah murmured. "She was," Jacob agreed, "and I tried to honor her wishes. But a few months back, I ran into a man who'd been part of that raid. He was drunk, running his mouth in a saloon. Told me the leader of that gang had headed north, settled down as a respectable businessman somewhere in Wyoming. Said his name was Edgar Harlow." Sarah froze, the blood draining from her face. "My uncle, you came here looking for my uncle," Jacob nodded, his expression pained. "I tracked him to Cody. Arrived with every intention of confronting him, making him pay somehow. I didn't know how exactly, but I was angry. Then I saw him dragging you from that church, and suddenly my own grievance seemed less important than helping you." Sarah pulled her hand away from his, her mind reeling. "So everything helping me, spending time with me, it was all to get close to my uncle?" "No," Jacob said firmly, reaching for her hand again. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. Meeting you changed everything. What I feel for you is real, Sarah, more real than anything I've felt in years." Sarah stood up, needing space to think. "How can I believe that?" "You came here with secrets, with a plan to hurt my family, a man who hurt innocent people, including you," Jacob interrupted, rising to stand before her. "Sarah, I'm not proud of coming here with revenge in my heart. But I thank God every day that I saw you first, that helping you became more important than settling an old score." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, torn between the feelings that had been growing in her heart and this new knowledge that threatened to shatter her trust. "What were you planning to do?" she asked quietly. "If you hadn't met me, what would you have done to my uncle?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "I don't know. I told myself I just wanted justice, to see him face the law for what he did to my father, but I was carrying a lot of anger. And now I just want a future," he said simply. "With you, if you'll forgive me for not being honest from the start." Sarah turned away, looking out at the creek where the water flowed endlessly onward, never returning to its source. "I need time to think." Jacob nodded, though she could see the pain in his eyes. "Of course, I'll take you back to town." The ride back to Cody was silent, the earlier joy of the day overshadowed by Jacob's revelation. When they reached the boarding house, Jacob helped her down from the buggy but didn't try to detain her when she turned immediately toward the door. "Sarah," he called softly as she reached the porch steps. "I'm sorry, for everything except meeting you." She paused, not turning back. "I know," she whispered, then continued into the house. That night, Sarah lay awake in her narrow bed, her thoughts in turmoil. She had fled one man's deception only to find herself entangled with another's. Yet Jacob's deception felt different. He had come clean, chosen honesty over continued secrecy. And he had never once treated her with anything but respect and kindness. Was it fair to judge him for seeking justice against a man who had murdered his father, a man who had mistreated her for years? By morning, Sarah had reached no firm conclusion, but she knew she needed to speak with Jacob again, to understand better the man he was now rather than the vengeful son he had been when he arrived in Cody. She was preparing to leave for church when Mrs. Abernathy knocked at her door. "There's a commotion in town," the landlady said, her expression worried. "They're saying Edgar Harlow's been shot." Sarah's heart seized in her chest. "Shot? Is he dead?" Mrs. Abernathy confirmed grimly. "Found behind his store this morning, and they're looking for your Mr. Vance." The world seemed to tilt beneath Sarah's feet. "No," she whispered. "He wouldn't." But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Jacob's revelation about his father's murder, the anger he must have carried all these years. Had yesterday's conversation been his way of preparing her for what he planned to do? Sarah rushed down the stairs and out into the street, heedless of Mrs. Abernathy's calls behind her. The town center was crowded with people gathered around the sheriff's office, voices raised in excited speculation. She pushed her way through, desperately searching for Jacob among the faces. Instead, she found Sheriff Tate on the boardwalk, addressing the crowd. "We'll conduct a proper investigation," he was saying. "In the meantime, I want no vigilante nonsense. The law will handle this." "Sheriff," Sarah called, drawing his attention. "Where is Jacob Vance?" The lawman's expression hardened at the sight of her. "Miss Harlow." "I was hoping to speak with you. Come inside." Heart hammering, Sarah followed him into the sheriff's office. To her immense relief, she saw Jacob seated on a bench against the wall, his hands free, no sign that he was under arrest. "Jacob," she exclaimed, rushing toward him. He stood quickly, catching her hands in his. "Sarah, it's all right, I'm just answering some questions." Sheriff Tate cleared his throat. "Mr. Vance was at the Sullivan Ranch all night. Half a dozen ranch hands can vouch for his whereabouts, but given his history with the deceased that he shared with me this morning, I needed to hear his account." Sarah looked between them, confusion mingling with relief. "Then you don't think he know," the sheriff said. "Whoever shot Edgar Harlow did it sometime after midnight, according to Doc Parker. Mr. Vance was playing cards with the hands until past 2, then slept in the bunkhouse." "Then who?" Sarah asked. Sheriff Tate sighed heavily. "That's what I'm trying to determine. Your uncle had plenty of enemies, Miss Harlow, as I'm sure you're aware. He wasn't just harsh with you, he drove hard bargains, foreclosed on farms, and apparently," he glanced at Jacob, "had a darker past than most folks in town realized." Jacob squeezed Sarah's hands gently. "I came into town as soon as I heard. Went straight to the sheriff to clear things up before rumors could spread." "You told him about your father?" Sarah asked quietly. Jacob nodded. "Everything. I should have done it sooner, but he was afraid of how it might look to you," Sheriff Tate finished for him. "Miss Harlow, I've known you since you were a child. I regret not stepping in when your uncle mistreated you. Many of us in town share that regret." Sarah blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the events of the morning. "What happens now?" "Now," the sheriff said, "I conduct my investigation. Mr. Vance is free to go, but I'd advise both of you to stay in town and available for questions." Outside the sheriff's office, the crowd had begun to disperse, though many cast curious glances at Sarah and Jacob as they emerged. The church bells were ringing, calling the faithful to Sunday service, but Sarah couldn't imagine sitting through a sermon today. "Come with me," Jacob said softly, leading her away from the curious onlookers. They walked in silence until they reached the small town park, finding a secluded bench beneath an old maple tree. "I didn't kill him, Sarah," Jacob said as soon as they were seated. "I swear to you on my parents' graves." Sarah studied his face, seeing only sincerity in his clear blue eyes. "I believe you." Relief washed over his features. "Even after what I told you yesterday." "Because of what you told me yesterday," she replied. "You could have kept your secret, especially if you were planning to do something about my uncle, but you chose honesty instead." Jacob took her hands in his again, his expression earnest. "I meant what I said. Somewhere between that church steps and now, revenge stopped mattering. All that matters is us, the future we might have." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. "I was so afraid when Mrs. Abernathy said they were looking for you. I thought I might lose you before I had a chance to tell you that I forgive you. That I understand why you came here, but I'm grateful for the man you chose to be instead. Jacob's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Carefully mindful that they were in public view, he reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. Sarah Harlow, he said softly, I've traveled half the country, seen mountains and deserts and rivers that would take your breath away, but nothing has ever been as beautiful to me as you are. Sarah's heart felt too full for words. Instead, she leaned forward and, throwing propriety to the wind, pressed a quick, soft kiss to his lips. When she pulled back, Jacob looked momentarily stunned, then broke into a grin that lit his whole face. I hope that means you might consider being courted by a reformed, vengeful cowboy. I might, Sarah replied, her own smile matching his, though Mrs. Abernathy will have something to say about proper courtship behavior. Their moment of joy was interrupted by the approach of Deputy Collins, looking uncomfortable in his role as bearer of news. Miss Harlow, Mr. Vance, he said, touching his hat brim. Sheriff asked me to find you. There's been a development. They followed him back to the sheriff's office, where they found Sheriff Tate looking grimly satisfied. We found the murder weapon, he announced without preamble. A revolver tossed in a rain barrel behind the saloon. And we have a witness who saw someone running from the direction of Harlow's store around the time of the shooting. Who was it? Jacob asked. The sheriff's expression was troubled. Jasper Miller, the gambler, Sarah asked in surprise. Jasper Miller was a fixture at the poker tables in the saloon, known for his flashy waistcoats and quick temper. The same, Sheriff Tate confirmed. We're bringing him in now, but the interesting part is what we found in your uncle's store safe, Miss Harlow. He placed a ledger on the desk. Appears your uncle was running money lending operations that weren't exactly legal, charging interest rates that would make a bank robber blush and using some unsavory collection methods. Like the men who killed my father, Jacob said quietly. The sheriff nodded. According to this, Miller owed your uncle a considerable sum, and the deadline for payment was today. Sarah sank into a chair, trying to absorb this new information about the man who had been her only family for so many years. I knew he was hard in his business dealings, but this. There's more, Sheriff Tate said, his voice gentler now. We found documents regarding your parents' property, Miss Harlow. It seems your father didn't die in debt, as your uncle claimed. In fact, he left a small but valuable parcel of land outside town that should have passed to you. Instead, your uncle took it for himself. Sarah felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. All these years living under her uncle's roof, being told she was a burden, that her parents had left her nothing but debts, all of it had been lies. The land is legally yours, the sheriff continued. With your uncle deceased and no will that we've found yet, as his only living relative, you'd inherit his properties as well the store, the house. Though I expect some creditors may come forward once word of his dealings gets out. Jacob moved to stand beside Sarah, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. Are you all right? She looked up at him, still trying to process everything. I don't know, it's a lot to take in. Sheriff Tate closed the ledger. Take some time, none of this needs to be settled today. And I should warn you both, there's likely to be talk. The coincidence of Mr. Vance arriving in town looking for Harlow and Harlow ending up dead. Let them talk, Jacob said firmly. The truth will out. As they left the sheriff's office for the second time that day, Sarah felt strangely detached from the town around her. Everything looked the same: the dusty main street, the familiar storefronts, the distant mountains, but everything had changed. What will you do now? Jacob asked as they walked slowly toward the boarding house. Sarah considered the question. I don't know, I never thought I'd own property or have choices about my future. It doesn't seem real. It's real, Jacob assured her. And whatever you decide, I'll support you. She looked up at him, this man who had ridden into her life only weeks ago and changed everything. Even if I decide to sell it all and move to San Francisco, a shadow crossed his face, but he nodded. Even then, though I'd miss you something fierce. Sarah couldn't maintain the pretense. She smiled, slipping her hand into his. I'm not going anywhere. My life is here now, a new life that I'm just beginning to build. The days that followed were a whirlwind of revelations and decisions. Jasper Miller confessed to killing Edgar Harlow after being confronted with the evidence. According to his testimony, he had gone to plead for more time to pay his debt, and when Harlow had threatened to take his prized horse as partial payment, Miller had drawn his gun. He claimed he'd meant only to frighten the businessman, but in the struggle that followed, the gun had discharged. With her uncle's death officially solved, Sarah found herself suddenly the owner of considerable property, her parents' land outside town, the general store on Main Street, and her uncle's house. The store, she decided, should be sold. Too many bitter memories were attached to it, and she had no interest in becoming a shopkeeper. The house presented a different dilemma. After much consideration, Sarah decided to sell it as well, using some of the proceeds to renovate the small cottage that stood on her parents' land. It would need work. 15 years of neglect had taken their toll, but the idea of living in a place that had once belonged to her parents appealed to her deeply. Jacob continued his work at the Sullivan Ranch, but he spent every free moment helping Sarah with plans for the cottage and sorting through the complicated tangle of her uncle's business affairs. Sheriff Tate proved an unexpected ally, helping to identify creditors with legitimate claims while dismissing those who sought to take advantage of a young woman they perceived as naive. Through it all, Sarah's relationship with Jacob deepened. Their courtship followed a more conventional path now, with proper calls at the boarding house, Sunday dinners, and chaperoned outings. Mrs. Abernathy maintained her watchful eye, but her initial caution had given way to genuine approval. "He's a good man," the landlady remarked one evening after Jacob had departed. "Not perfect, mind you, no man is, but he looks at you like you hang the moon and stars." Sarah blushed, but couldn't deny the observation. Jacob did look at her that way, and she found herself more and more certain that the feeling was mutual. By late July, work on the cottage was well underway. Jacob had enlisted several of the ranch hands to help with the major repairs, and Sarah had chosen simple, practical furnishings that reminded her of the home she remembered from childhood. On a warm Saturday evening, Jacob invited Sarah for a ride out to see the progress. The cottage sat on a gentle rise overlooking a small stream with the mountains visible in the distance. Wildflowers bloomed across the meadow, painting the landscape in vivid yellows and purples. "It's coming along nicely," Sarah remarked as they approached the cottage. The roof had been repaired, the porch rebuilt, and fresh paint applied to the exterior. "Another few weeks and it will be ready." Jacob helped her down from the buggy, but instead of leading her toward the house, he guided her to the large oak tree that shaded the yard. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice suddenly serious. Sarah's heart quickened as Jacob took both her hands in his. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, his blue eyes never leaving hers. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. I came to Cody looking for justice, but I found something far more precious. I found you, Sarah. You're the bravest, kindest, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and I can't imagine my life without you in it." To her astonishment, Jacob dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "I know it hasn't been that long, and if you think we should wait, I'll understand. But I love you, Sarah Harlow. Will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes as joy welled up inside her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Jacob, I will." He rose quickly, pulling her into his arms, and this time their kiss was neither quick nor chaste. When they finally parted, both breathless and smiling, Jacob reached into his pocket and withdrew a small gold ring with a modest pearl setting. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "She made me promise I'd only give it to someone truly special." Sarah admired the ring, her heart too full for words. From that terrible Sunday when she'd been dragged from church by her hair to this moment of perfect happiness, the journey seemed impossible, yet here they were. "I have something else to show you," Jacob said, leading her toward the cottage. "A surprise." Inside, the main room had been transformed since her last visit. Fresh plaster covered the walls, ready for paint, and the wooden floors had been sanded smooth. But what caught Sarah's eye was the new piece of furniture in the corner, a beautiful upright piano. "Jacob," she gasped, moving toward it in wonder, "how did you?" "Sullivan was selling it. His daughter got a new one from back east." Jacob smiled, pleased by her reaction. "You mentioned once that your mother played, that you wished you could have learned. I thought maybe now you could." Sarah ran her fingers over the polished wood, tears threatening again. "It's perfect. Everything is perfect." Jacob came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Not quite everything. Not until you're here with me, until this is our home." She turned in his arms, resting her head against his chest. "I never thought I'd have this a home of my own, a man who truly loves me." "You deserve all of it and more," Jacob said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that." They were married in late August in the same church where they had first met. Pastor Williams, eager to make amends for his inaction that day, performed the ceremony with particular warmth and eloquence. Mrs. Miller had sewn Sarah a beautiful wedding dress of ivory silk, and Mrs. Abernathy had baked a three-tiered cake, decorated with late summer roses. The entire town turned out for the celebration, even Sheriff Tate, unbent enough to share a glass of champagne and offer his congratulations. Mr. Sullivan, impressed by Jacob's work with his horses, presented the couple with a matched pair of bay geldings as a wedding gift. As the summer faded into autumn, Sarah and Jacob settled into their cottage. Jacob continued his work at the Sullivan Ranch, while Sarah discovered a talent for bookkeeping, helping several local businesses manage their accounts. The piano became a centerpiece of their evenings, with Sarah slowly teaching herself to play while Jacob accompanied her on his fiddle. Their first Christmas as husband and wife brought a heavy snowfall that blanketed the countryside in pristine white. They celebrated quietly in their cozy cottage, exchanging simple gifts before a roaring fire. "I have something for you," Sarah said, handing Jacob a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red ribbon. "It's not much, but if it's from you, it's precious," Jacob interrupted, carefully unwrapping the gift to reveal a silver pocket watch. Opening it, he found an inscription inside the cover. "To JV, time brought us together, love will keep us so, SV, Sarah," he breathed, deeply moved. "It's perfect." "Look inside the paper," she urged, her eyes shining with a secret. Jacob unfolded the wrapping paper to find a tiny knitted bootie. "Are you?" he asked, his voice catching. Sarah nodded, her smile radiant. "In June, the doctor says, we're going to have a baby, Jacob." With a whoop of joy, Jacob lifted her from her chair, spinning her around before carefully setting her back down, suddenly mindful of her condition. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "A family of our own. The family we both lost and found again in each other." Sarah agreed, resting her hand on her still flat stomach. As they stood together before the fire, snow falling gently outside their windows, Sarah thought back to that fateful Sunday less than a year ago. The pain and fear of that day had led, through a winding and unexpected path, to this moment of perfect happiness. A new life growing inside her, a loving husband by her side, and a future bright with promise. In the spring of 1879, Sarah gave birth to a healthy son they named Thomas, after Jacob's father. The baby had his mother's chestnut hair and his father's blue eyes, and from his first lusty cry, it was clear he had inherited both his parents' determination. As Sarah recovered from the birth, Jacob took to fatherhood with natural ease, often walking the floor with the fussing infant so Sarah could rest. From the window of their bedroom, she would watch them in the garden, Jacob pointing out butterflies and birds to the wide-eyed baby cradled in his strong arms. "He's going to be just like his papa," Mrs. Abernathy observed during one of her frequent visits to check on the new mother and child. "Strong and kind-hearted." "I hope so," Sarah agreed, her heart full as she watched the two most important people in her world. Life settled into a new rhythm with Thomas at its center. The cottage rang with laughter and occasional tears, with lullabies in the evening and the gentle sounds of family life throughout the day. Jacob's position at the Sullivan Ranch grew more secure, and by Thomas's first birthday, Mr. Sullivan had promoted him to foreman with a substantial increase in pay. Sarah's bookkeeping business flourished as well, allowing her to work from home while caring for Thomas. The money she'd received from selling her uncle's properties was carefully invested, providing a cushion of security they had never expected to have. As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined them 2 years after Thomas, followed by another son, Daniel, 3 years later. Their home expanded as well, with Jacob adding rooms to the cottage as their family's needs changed. Sarah often marveled at how completely her life had transformed. The frightened young woman who had endured years of mistreatment was now a confident mother and respected businesswoman. The town that had once turned a blind eye to her suffering now welcomed her as an integral part of the community. And Jacob, the vengeful cowboy who had ridden into Cody seeking justice, had found redemption and purpose as a husband and father. The anger that had driven him for so many years had given way to a deep contentment that showed in the easy smile he wore and the gentle way he treated his family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob surprised Sarah with a trip to Denver, their first real vacation since their wedding. Mrs. Abernathy, now a beloved honorary grandmother to their children, stayed at the cottage while they traveled, promising to spoil the children just enough but not too much. In their comfortable hotel room in Denver, after a day of exploring the city and an elegant dinner, Sarah and Jacob stood by the window, looking out at the lights of the growing city. "Happy?" Jacob asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Sarah leaned back against his chest, sighing contentedly, "More than I ever dreamed possible." "Sometimes I think about that Sunday," Jacob admitted, "how differently things might have turned out if I'd arrived in town a day later or if I'd been on the other side of town when I heard that scream." Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "But you weren't. You were right where you needed to be when I needed you most." Jacob brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch still sending a thrill through her after all these years. "Do you ever regret it?" "Marrying a man who came to town with vengeance in his heart?" "Never," Sarah said firmly. "That man made a choice to help instead of hurt, to love instead of hate. That's the man I married, and I've never had a moment's doubt." As Jacob lowered his lips to hers, Sarah closed her eyes, grateful beyond words for the twist of fate that had brought them together. From a moment of public humiliation and fear had grown a lifetime of love, proving that even the darkest beginnings could lead to the brightest of futures. And in that hotel room in Denver, 10 years after a cowboy had intervened on a church steps saying, "You'll answer to me before God," Sarah and Jacob renewed the promises they had made to each other. Not with formal vows, but with whispered words of love and the tender communion of two hearts that had found in each other exactly what they needed: redemption, courage, and a love that would last all their days.